Night falls over Detroit. The sky glows not with searchlights or flak bursts, but with the eerie reflection of molten steel and blazing furnaces. 1,000 miles from the front lines, another kind of war is being fought, not in the air, but on the assembly line. The rhythmic pounding of presses sounds like artillery. Sparks fly like tracer fire. And here, in this cathedral of industry, men and women work in silence, racing against time. Every 63 minutes, a bomber must be born. In 1942, Allied intelligence was desperate. German U-boats were sinking ships faster than America could build them. Over Europe, British cities were burning. The United States had entered the war late, and if it hoped to catch up, it would have to do something no nation had ever done before: build war machines as fast as consumer cars. And that's when the unthinkable happened. The Ford Motor Company, led by the eccentric industrial giant Henry Ford and his visionary son Edsel, was given a task that seemed closer to madness than strategy. Construct a plant so vast it could produce a 4-engine bomber, a plane made of 1.5 million parts, faster than Germany could believe possible. When the first German intelligence reports arrived describing the scale of the Willow Run facility, the Reich's top engineers laughed. Their best factories, hidden deep in Bavaria, could produce perhaps one bomber every few days. How could a nation of car salesmen produce one every hour? The Nazis assumed it was Allied propaganda. But soon they would realize it was no myth. Because somewhere in Michigan, a new kind of weapon was being forged, not of metal, but of method. A factory so immense, it had its own weather. A production line so relentless, it turned the impossible into routine. And this story of how Ford turned industrial chaos into aerial power would become one of the greatest engineering miracles of the Second World War. But behind the miracle lay tension, betrayal, exhaustion, and death. German spies were dispatched to uncover how Ford did it. What they found stunned even Hitler's war planners. This is not just a story about machines. It's a story about obsession, about how a single idea, born in the mind of a man who once refused to build weapons, became a cornerstone of Allied victory. Because in this war, speed was survival. And in a world on fire, Henry Ford's factory would become the engine of the sky. What did the spies see when they walked into Willow Run? How did civilians become the soldiers of industry? And how did the man who built the Model T end up building the bomber that would change history? Before the miracle of Willow Run, before Ford's conveyor belts began spitting out bombers like clockwork, America was unprepared, emotionally, industrially, and militarily, for the total war that engulfed Europe. The year was 1939. Germany's blitzkrieg had shattered Poland in mere weeks, its panzer divisions rolling like iron waves. Across the Atlantic, Americans watched with disbelief. The Great Depression had left factories idle, spirits low, and the military astonishingly weak. The U.S. Army Air Corps possessed fewer than 2,000 aircraft, many of them outdated biplanes. And yet, within just a few years, this same nation would produce more than 300,000 aircraft. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because of fear and vision. The Luftwaffe's dominance over Europe was absolute. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 sliced through the skies with deadly precision, while the Junkers U-88 and Heinkel He-111 delivered destruction from above. Britain fought back valiantly in the Battle of Britain, but even there, victory came at an unbearable cost. Factories were bombed, pilots died faster than they could be trained, and the Allies' industrial base strained under the pressure. The war had become a contest, not of courage, but of production. Whoever could build faster would win. Across the ocean, Henry Ford watched. The man who once said, "War is a waste of time," now faced a moral reckoning. His empire of machines had been built for peace, for cars, tractors, and prosperity. Yet even he could not ignore the telegrams, the newsreels, the sinking ships, and the call from Washington. Roosevelt's administration had realized that private industry would have to be weaponized. The arsenal of democracy could not come from generals. It had to come from businessmen. In 1940, a radical idea took shape. If Detroit could build 1,000,000 cars a year, why not bombers? The B-24 Liberator, a long-range heavy bomber designed by Consolidated Aircraft, was chosen as the model. It was a technological marvel, capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs over 2,000 miles. But it was also a logistical nightmare. Over 1.5 million individual components, thousands of wires, gauges, rivets, and panels. A machine that had previously taken skilled craftsmen months to assemble. Henry Ford's engineers stared at the blueprints in disbelief. This was not a car. It was a flying fortress. Each B-24 required 55,000 separate operations to complete. Its wings alone were so large they couldn't be transported by road. They had to be built on site. And yet Ford's son, Edsel Ford, believed it could be done. Edsel was gentler than his father, more modern in his outlook. He understood both aviation and mass production, and he saw that the war demanded something entirely new, a factory the size of a city. In the autumn of 1941, construction began on a vast field west of Detroit, near a small creek called Willow Run. It would become the largest single-roof factory in the world, stretching over 3.5 million square feet. The architects and engineers who walked the muddy grounds that fall could hardly imagine what would rise there. Assembly lines a mile long, massive forges, and runways extending straight from the plant doors. Ford's dream was audacious: to take the techniques that had revolutionized car manufacturing and apply them to aviation, where tolerances were microscopic and failure meant death. But as the first steel girders went up, skeptics laughed. Aviation experts claimed that no automobile factory could produce aircraft, not with the precision required. Even within the government, there were doubts. The Air Corps expected delays, chaos, even disaster. But Edsel Ford believed the opposite, that standardization and flow production could beat the German model of artisan engineering. Where Germany relied on skilled craftsmen and small workshops, America would rely on automation and scale. And beyond the technical challenge, there was a human one. Tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, farmers' sons, and migrants from the South, poured into Michigan to work at Willow Run. They were not engineers nor soldiers, but they would become both. In training halls, women learned to rivet and weld. Men who had never left their hometowns now assembled bomber wings with military precision. For the first time in history, war production had become democratic. The world outside the factory was burning. In December 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. The United States was at war. Within weeks, every automobile plant in Detroit had been repurposed for military production. Tanks rolled off Chrysler's lines, machine guns from General Motors, and aircraft engines from Packard. The arsenal of democracy was no longer just a slogan, it was a heartbeat. And Willow Run was its thunder. Still, as 1942 began, chaos reigned. The plant was unfinished, blueprints changed weekly, parts arrived late, and completed bombers sat idle, missing engines or instruments. Henry Ford, now in his late 70s, clashed with military inspectors. His pacifist beliefs and stubborn pride collided with the urgency of war. Edsel bore the burden quietly, his health deteriorating under pressure. Yet in the midst of confusion, something extraordinary began to take shape. The first B-24 Liberator rolled out, gleaming under the Michigan sun. It was proof that the impossible could be touched. But what no one could yet know was that this was just the beginning. Behind closed doors, German spies were already gathering intelligence. In Berlin, reports described the Willow Run plant as the largest airplane factory ever conceived. The numbers seemed absurd. 24-hour shifts, 40,000 workers, a new bomber every hour. The Luftwaffe's analysts dismissed it as Allied propaganda. But those who had seen the photographs, endless lines of machines, engines stacked like ammunition, men and women working in perfect rhythm, began to whisper. If this was real, then Germany's industrial might was doomed. What began as a bold experiment was now a matter of survival. The United States had entered a war where factories were battlefields, machines were soldiers, and the speed of production was the weapon that would decide the fate of nations. And in the heart of that storm, at Willow Run, the next phase of the miracle was about to unfold, one that would push both men and machines to their breaking point. By the spring of 1942, Willow Run was alive with motion, yet haunted by chaos. The assembly line, conceived as a symphony of efficiency, often resembled a battlefield. Conveyors jammed, parts were miscounted, and rivets were missing. Bombers sat incomplete, wings without engines, fuselages without cockpits. The Air Corps inspectors were relentless. Every delay was a threat not only to morale, but to survival. The Allies were losing planes faster than they could be replaced. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, and cities in Britain were still smoldering from nightly raids. Each missing bomber was more than a statistic. It was a mission that might fail, a life lost in the skies over Europe. Inside Willow Run, the tension was suffocating. Young women riveters, nicknamed Rosies, worked 12-hour shifts in deafening heat, sweat mingling with the metallic tang of rivets and paint. Men, many of them farm boys unaccustomed to industrial labor, struggled to keep pace with the precision required. Mistakes were not abstract. They could result in structural failure mid-flight, catastrophe for the crews who would rely on these machines to survive. The pressure was enormous. Managers shouted over the din. Supervisors kept tally sheets that seemed to change hourly, and Ford executives walked the aisles with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Outside, the world was no less brutal. Pilots returning from bombing missions told stories of disasters, formations shattered by flak, engines shot out by enemy fighters, bombers lost to navigation errors over unfamiliar terrain. The B-24, though technologically advanced, had vulnerabilities. Its long, slender wings could snap under stress, and without experienced crews, even a small error could be fatal. Every loss in Europe reverberated back to Willow Run, a haunting reminder that industrial failure translated directly into death. Amid this pressure, morale wavered. Some workers resigned, unable to cope with the endless demands. Engineers argued over designs, tradesmen fought over methods, and every day brought new bottlenecks, delayed engines, misprinted blueprints, a shortage of wiring. Even Henry Ford, who once revolutionized industry with the Model T, grew frustrated. The methods that had made him legendary in the automobile world were now straining under the complexity of warplanes. Each B-24 required a coordination of skill, timing, and human endurance far beyond anything he had attempted before. Meanwhile, German intelligence remained skeptical. Reports filtered back to Berlin describing a factory producing bombers at an unheard-of rate. They assumed exaggeration. How could a nation of car manufacturers outpace the finest engineers of the Luftwaffe? Yet these rumors gnawed at military planners. If Willow Run was real, Germany's advantage in aerial warfare might soon evaporate. Spies were dispatched, cameras hidden in briefcases, blueprints sketched in secret. But even they could not immediately comprehend the scale, nor the urgency, of what was unfolding. Within the U.S. military hierarchy, debates raged. Some commanders insisted that the B-24 was too complex, that production should be slowed to ensure quality. Others argued for speed at any cost, reasoning that sheer numbers could overwhelm the enemy. In this crucible of conflicting priorities, Willow Run teetered on the edge of failure. Bombers rolled out half-finished, engines without instruments, fuselages without proper wiring. The fear of disaster hung over every shift. It was in this climate of desperation that necessity began to breed innovation. Supervisors experimented with assembly sequences, testing new methods to streamline work. Engineers created sub-assemblies that could be completed in parallel, then integrated at the final stages. Edsel, often walking the lines silently, encouraged workers to propose improvements. Some ideas seemed absurd at first, moving heavy parts on overhead tracks, reorganizing entire departments, even implementing timed work cycles down to the second. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, the machine of Willow Run began to hum more smoothly. Stories of early failures became lessons etched into every level of the operation. One tragic incident involved a partially assembled bomber collapsing under its own weight, crushing scaffolding, and nearly killing several workers. Another involved misrouted wiring that rendered a plane inoperable hours before inspection. Each setback was a shock, but also a spark. Engineers sketched solutions on scrap paper, mechanics devised jigs and templates, and production teams experimented with synchronization. Every mistake forced the factory to adapt, and every adaptation pushed the boundaries of what had been thought possible. By the end of 1942, a fragile rhythm was emerging. The first B-24s were leaving Willow Run with engines and instruments properly installed. Pilots trained on simulators that were themselves makeshift, cardboard mock-ups, chalk diagrams on hangar floors. Yet when they climbed into the cockpits, they felt the weight of history on their shoulders. Each bomber that lifted into the sky represented not only technological triumph, but human perseverance. Every successful flight reassured those back on the line that their exhaustion and sacrifice had meaning. And yet, for all the progress, the crisis had not ended. Production was still far below the ultimate goal: one fully assembled bomber every 63 minutes. Workers were pushed to their limits, and morale remained fragile. The looming question hung over the factory like a storm cloud. Could Willow Run achieve the impossible, or would the chaos overwhelm the genius of its design? It was at this precipice, between failure and triumph, despair and ingenuity, that the seeds of a revolutionary solution were sown. A new approach to assembly, a daring reimagining of workflow and coordination, would soon emerge. Something had to give. Ordinary methods were no longer sufficient. The war demanded speed, precision, and audacity, and Willow Run would rise to meet the challenge in ways that would astonish even its most skeptical observers, and terrify the spies who had come to witness its progress. The stage was set. The crisis had sharpened minds, tested endurance, and revealed that only extraordinary innovation could overcome the impossible task of mass-producing the B-24 bomber. And from this crucible, the breakthrough that would change the course of aviation and the war itself was about to be born. By mid-1943, Willow Run teetered on the edge of legend. The factory still hummed with chaos, hundreds of riveters, mechanics, and engineers moving in what often seemed like frantic improvisation. But something fundamental had shifted. The desperation of the previous year had forced Ford's team to rethink the very concept of production. They realized that simply scaling up old methods would never suffice. To achieve the impossible, a bomber every 63 minutes, they needed a radical approach, one that redefined industrial logic itself. The breakthrough came not from a single genius, but from a convergence of minds under relentless pressure. Edsel Ford convened teams of engineers, production supervisors, and even assembly line workers, encouraging them to challenge every assumption. One junior engineer, a former automobile mechanic named Charles E. Sorensen, proposed a revolutionary idea. Instead of assembling a bomber in place, why not divide the process into parallel subassemblies? Wings, fuselage, tail sections, and engines could be built simultaneously in separate sections of the factory, then merged on a moving track that functioned as a spine for the entire plane. It was audacious, unprecedented in aviation. In Detroit's auto plants, cars moved along assembly lines, but they were relatively simple machines. The B-24 was a fortress of 1.5 million components. Could this method survive the complexity? Edsel and his team decided to test the concept. They selected a small section of Willow Run and began assembling a single bomber using the new flow system. Workers were nervous. Every misstep could destroy the test aircraft, and delays had real consequences for the war effort. The line moved like a carefully choreographed dance, with mechanics synchronizing rivets, wires, and engine mounts to the second. Supervisors timed each operation, looking for inefficiencies. The factory floor became a theater of precision, men and women moving in synchronized patterns, tools glinting under harsh fluorescent lights, sparks flying in timed rhythm. The results were uneven. Some sections lagged behind, wings arrived late, engines misaligned, and cables tangled. But unlike previous attempts, every problem was logged, analyzed, and corrected immediately. The new system allowed continuous adaptation. The factory learned in real time. Within weeks, the method was refined to the point where the first fully assembled bomber could emerge in a matter of hours, not weeks. The moment of triumph arrived quietly. On a cool morning, the first B-24 completed, under the new system, rolled off the line, gleaming under the Michigan sun. Engineers and supervisors held their breath as pilots climbed in and taxied to the runway. The engines roared to life without a hitch. When the plane lifted off, it carried more than bombs. It carried the weight of innovation, endurance, and human ingenuity. News of the breakthrough spread rapidly within military circles. At a briefing in Washington, officials marveled at the speed and precision of the production. One Air Corps officer reportedly said, "It is as if the factory itself has learned to fly." Meanwhile, German spies, who had infiltrated intelligence networks, began reporting alarming accounts. mass production at a scale they had deemed impossible, assembly lines moving with uncanny efficiency, aircraft leaving the plant faster than their Luftwaffe strategists could calculate. Hitler's engineers, once dismissive, now faced disbelief. America's industrial might had transcended expectation. A nation of carmakers was producing warplanes with the precision of a military academy. The breakthrough extended beyond mere speed. By standardizing parts and streamlining assembly, Willow Run reduced errors, improved safety, and created a replicable system that could be scaled further. Women and men who had once struggled to keep pace now became masters of the workflow, their skills amplified by the new methodology. The factory had become a living organism, responsive, adaptable, and almost human in its efficiency. Even Henry Ford, initially skeptical of military production, began to grasp the magnitude of what had been achieved. Though still quiet and deliberate in public, he allowed the factory to expand further, investing in machinery, jigs, and even experimental techniques for precision alignment. The B-24 was no longer just a plane. It was a symbol of industrial innovation, a testament to what could be accomplished when necessity met creativity. The first combat units equipped with Willow Run B-24s experienced the results immediately. Formations flew with unprecedented numbers, sustained bombing campaigns became feasible, and missions previously considered suicidal were now achievable. Enemy planners were confounded. German fighters, once able to intercept small groups of bombers with deadly efficiency, now faced waves of aircraft too numerous to counter effectively. The balance of air power was shifting, not solely because of bravery in the sky, but because of strategy in the factory. By the end of 1943, Willow Run had reached the legendary rate of a bomber every 63 minutes, a feat so staggering that Allied propaganda initially downplayed it for fear of appearing boastful. But the world could not remain ignorant for long. Photographs, pilot accounts, and later espionage reports confirmed the scale. German spies, who had once laughed at the idea of American mass production, now returned reports marked with disbelief and alarm. Willow Run had become a weapon as decisive as any fighter or bomber, a factory that reshaped the very logic of war. In that moment, it became clear. Victory would not belong solely to the sky warriors, but to the engineers, the riveters, the logisticians who had dared to reimagine the impossible. What began as desperation had evolved into genius, and the consequences would reverberate across battlefields, production lines, and the history of industrial engineering for generations. By 1944, the impact of Willow Run reverberated across every theater of war. The B-24 Liberators produced in Michigan were no longer rare machines of careful craftsmanship. They were relentless instruments of Allied strategy. Squadrons equipped with these aircraft could mount sustained bombing campaigns over Europe, striking industrial hubs, oil refineries, and rail yards with precision and scale that Germany had never anticipated. What had begun as a technical experiment had become a decisive instrument of war, shifting the balance of air power in favor of the Allies. The victories were tangible. In the skies over the Ruhr Valley, waves of B-24s rained ordnance on factories essential to the German war effort. Pilots reported formations so vast that enemy flak units became overwhelmed, firing at shadows more than targets. Each bomber that returned safely carried the dual victory of the aircrew and the invisible army of Willow Run workers. Strategic bombing, once limited by the production rate of aircraft, now became feasible on a scale that could cripple a nation's industrial backbone. Yet success was not without its costs. The rapid pace of production introduced new risks. Some bombers, assembled under extreme pressure, exhibited minor structural faults that occasionally led to catastrophic failures in the air. Engines sometimes failed, landing gear collapsed on takeoff, and instruments malfunctioned in extreme conditions. Each incident became a learning point. Engineers at Willow Run quickly analyzed every mishap, revising assembly protocols and redesigning components. The factory itself became an iterative laboratory, continuously evolving in response to both human error and wartime demands. The human cost, too, was profound. The relentless pace imposed immense strain on the workforce. Women, who now formed the backbone of the production effort, worked in shifts that blurred days into nights. Many suffered exhaustion, injuries, or stress-related illnesses. Men who had joined from rural America faced the same pressures. Absenteeism, fatigue, and workplace accidents were constant challenges, yet morale remained surprisingly resilient, fueled by a shared sense of purpose. Each completed bomber symbolized not just industrial achievement, but personal sacrifice, an affirmation that ordinary people could wield extraordinary power when called upon. On the strategic front, the consequences were undeniable. Germany, which had counted on the superiority of its Luftwaffe and the vulnerability of Allied air forces, was forced into a defensive posture. The sheer volume of bombers strained anti-aircraft defenses, disrupted supply lines, and compelled the redeployment of fighter units away from offensive campaigns. The war's tempo accelerated. Where once battles had been fought in careful increments, the air war now surged in waves, relentless and overwhelming. Allied commanders increasingly relied on massed formations, secure in the knowledge that Willow Run could replenish losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Lessons emerged not only in aviation, but in management, logistics, and industrial organization. Willow Run became a blueprint for large-scale production under extreme conditions. Techniques pioneered there, assembly line subassemblies, workflow standardization, and rapid problem-solving, would later influence post-war manufacturing in automobiles, electronics, and aerospace. The war had forced the United States to innovate at a pace unmatched in peacetime, revealing that industrial agility could be as decisive as battlefield courage. Yet even in triumph, mistakes lingered. The initial obsession with speed sometimes compromised quality. Certain squadrons reported mechanical failures in early missions, and the pressure to meet quotas occasionally led to oversight. Supervisors had to balance urgency with precision, learning the hard way that production without care could undercut even the most formidable strategy. These lessons were costly but essential, forging a system that became both faster and more reliable over time. As the war progressed, Willow Run's contribution became symbolic. German spies, initially skeptical, now documented the factory with a mix of fear and respect. Reports in Berlin described a nation mobilized not just for war, but for industrial mastery. Hitler's engineers, who had once dismissed American capacity, recognized too late that production speed, scale, and adaptability could rival even the best-designed fighter or bomber. The American advantage in aircraft numbers became decisive, tipping air superiority toward the Allies and enabling operations such as the Normandy invasion and sustained strategic bombing campaigns across Germany. But beyond the statistics, the true legacy lay in human ingenuity. Ordinary workers, guided by innovative engineers and inspired leadership, had transformed a chaotic, underperforming factory into a machine of unparalleled efficiency. The B-24s were not merely tools of destruction. They were embodiments of collaboration, persistence, and the capacity to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Each plane that left Willow Run carried with it countless untold stories of trial, error, and triumph. By the war's end, Willow Run had produced over 8,600 B-24 bombers, a staggering testament to what industrial innovation could achieve. The consequences were evident not only in the balance of power in the air, but in the broader trajectory of modern manufacturing. The war had demanded speed, ingenuity, and courage, and in response, America had delivered. The story of Willow Run is a story of adaptation, learning, and relentless pursuit of a goal against impossible odds. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments of crisis, innovation can turn desperation into decisive advantage, and that the human capacity to organize, create, and endure can shape the course of history itself. As the echoes of war faded and the world began to rebuild, Willow Run stood as a monument not to destruction, but to human ingenuity. The massive hangars, once filled with the roar of machinery and the chatter of tens of thousands of workers, became quieter, yet their impact resonated far beyond Michigan. The B-24 Liberators, forged in steel, sweat, and fire, had carried the weight of a global conflict. They had altered the trajectory of the Second World War, proving that industrial innovation could be as decisive as battlefield heroism. Henry Ford, who had once been hesitant to embrace military production, lived long enough to witness his factory's extraordinary achievement. Though aged and increasingly withdrawn, he recognized that Willow Run was unlike anything the world had ever seen. His son Edsel, whose health had declined under the strain of overseeing the production miracle, had passed away before the war ended, leaving a legacy of quiet determination and visionary management. The men and women who had labored on the lines, often overlooked in the grand narratives of history, had become unsung heroes. Their hands had built the aircraft that dominated the skies. Their endurance had turned a desperate plan into a decisive force. The factory's innovations transcended the war. Techniques pioneered at Willow Run, assembly line subassemblies, precision workflow management, rapid adaptation to error, would influence post-war industry, from automotive manufacturing to aerospace engineering. Universities studied the methods, business schools incorporated them into curricula, and corporations around the globe sought to replicate the system that had enabled a nation to produce thousands of bombers at record pace. The philosophy was simple, yet profound. With ingenuity, coordination, and the courage to challenge convention, even the most impossible tasks could be achieved. Yet the story of Willow Run is not only one of triumph, it is a testament to the cost of innovation. Every bomber represented countless hours of labor, uncounted injuries, and relentless pressure on those who worked in the factory. Each success was born of risk and endurance. History remembers the planes in the air, the victories over enemy skies, but the sacrifices on the ground, the exhaustion, the mistakes corrected in real time, the courage to keep moving forward despite setbacks, were equally pivotal. The lesson is enduring. Progress often demands both vision and grit, and true achievement rarely comes without price. In the larger sweep of history, Willow Run symbolizes the power of human imagination applied to necessity. German spies who had once scoffed at the idea of American mass production were forced to confront the reality of a system that combined speed, precision, and adaptability on an unprecedented scale. The plant demonstrated that victory in modern warfare depended not only on strategy or valor, but on the capacity to mobilize an entire society's knowledge, resources, and labor in pursuit of a singular goal. It reshaped the concept of industrial warfare and left a legacy that endured long after the last B-24 had flown its final mission. The philosophical resonance of Willow Run lies in its demonstration of courage, not merely in combat, but in thought and action. To conceive a factory that could produce a bomber every 63 minutes was to defy convention, to embrace uncertainty, and to trust human capability against overwhelming odds. It was a reminder that innovation often begins where fear and doubt are strongest, and that history favors those who dare to imagine what others deem impossible. As one walks the quiet remnants of the site today, the sprawling hangars, now silent, echo faintly with the rhythm of assembly lines that once defied disbelief. The planes themselves are gone, scattered across airfields and museums, yet the lessons remain. Willow Run teaches that extraordinary achievement arises from ordinary people pushed to the edge, guided by vision, ingenuity, and relentless persistence. It is a story of transformation, of chaos into order, potential into reality, and impossibility into triumph. In the end, Willow Run is more than a factory. It is a symbol of what can be accomplished when human determination meets the machinery of imagination. The B-24s that took to the skies carried the hopes, fears, and dreams of an entire generation. And though they were weapons of war, they also embodied the profound capacity of people to rise, adapt, and overcome. The final reflection is simple yet enduring. Courage and creativity are the engines of progress, and the price of greatness is always measured not in triumph alone, but in the perseverance, risk, and ingenuity required to reach it. History remembers battles, leaders, and strategies, but Willow Run reminds us that sometimes the most decisive victories are built quietly, on the ground, one rivet at a time. And in that quiet, the echo of human ingenuity continues to resonate, long after the last bomber has landed.